Can we agree on something? Expansion teams are one of the coolest things in sports. Oh, come on. Expansion teams always have some sort of mysticism around them. They've yet to fail or succeed, yet to build any narratives around themselves, yet to build a legacy. Just a fresh coat of paint and unwavering optimism for the future, something not many teams can say about themselves. Whether we realize it or not, we build up a subconscious perception of sports teams when they've been around for a while. Falling short, gluttony, beer. Kinda boring, but really good. Expansion teams have none of that, which is why I think a lot of people are drawn to like them. I don't have any proof of that, but I've seen too many people wearing Las Vegas Golden Knights and Seattle Kraken merchandise in Connecticut to think otherwise. Everybody loves expansion teams until you actually watch them play. In the current NBA rule set, a new expansion teams triggers what's called an expansion draft, where each existing NBA team has to put up their bottom 7 guys for the taking. In short, expansion teams are feeding off table scraps in the beginning, which should be expected. While expansion teams do usually go on to find some level of success, after all, most teams were expansion teams at one point or another, these teams usually suck when they first begin. But expansion teams, especially in the modern era, have been some of the most interesting NBA teams put together, no doubt. You got teams running around with an entire group of misfits, borderline rotation guys, totally unfinished young players, and older guys who their original teams have considered expendable at this point in their careers. Expansion teams join the NBA tanking by default. They've got to put in their time of washed up has-beens taking up 20 shots a game before history works itself out and they build a hopefully long legacy of success and prosperity. If they can even last that long, of course. To start our journey of looking at every NBA expansion team in the league's history, we gotta look at the times of plumbers and carpenters, and man, this gets chaotic, no doubt. The NBA was not profitable at its inception, and owners who bought into the concept were willing to pull out in an instant if the venture wasn't profitable. Teams were folding left and right as the league tried to stay afloat. Hilarious in contrast to today, where pro sports teams are probably the safest investment you can make long term. To really see what I mean, let's look at the NBA's inaugural season in 1947, which saw 11 teams take the court. 11 expansion teams, if you will. Yeah, 4 of them folded after one season. Out of these original 11 teams, 3 of them exist to this day. The Boston Celtics, New York Knicks, and Philadelphia, now Golden State Warriors. The Warriors would come away with the title in this first season, a trend they'd continue for their long, storied history. But what about the other teams whose road ended right where it started? The Toronto Huskies, Cleveland Rebels, Pittsburgh Ironmen, and Detroit Falcons all indeed folded after the league's first ever season. Of course, 3 of these cities would eventually get another NBA team, sorry Pittsburgh, but one thing these failed franchises had in common was they sucked. Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Toronto had the 3 worst records in the league, but interestingly enough, Cleveland actually qualified for the playoffs in their first season and still folded. They had a better record than the Celtics in their first year. Imagine that alternate timeline. The Cavs were instead the Rebels, and Boston had to get a new team called the Green Beans or something. Pretty interesting to think about. These 4 folded franchises had a combined 10 different coaches in their first year alone. This includes the Toronto Huskies, who had 4 coaches themselves in their only season, including 2 of their own players, a football coach who ran the team on the side, and a former New York Yankees all-star who, funnily enough, found the most success at the helm. So yeah, this should give you a picture of what this older era was like for new teams. Total chaos, financial instability, just a bunch of grown men playing a kid's game for anyone who wanted to watch. Something I can honestly envy a bit when I compare it to the hyper-profitability and rigidness of professional sports today. In the NBA's second season, they replaced the 4 teams they lost with just one new one, the Baltimore Bullets, but not those Baltimore, then Washington Bullets, now Washington Wizards, those Baltimore Bullets, different franchises. These Baltimore Bullets were the NBA's first true expansion team, the first group of new kids on the block. As you would expect, the Bullets' youthfulness and inexperience showed through, and in their first season, they won the finals, alright. Now, to be fair, back then, expansion teams did work a lot differently. Unlike today, where it goes something like, hey buddy, to start your journey in our multi-billion-dollar empire, here's your first star player, Kyle Kuzma. Have fun going 15 and 67. It went more like existing professional team from a different league joins the NBA and signs good players from other teams and is, as a result, immediately good. At this time, the NBA wasn't the be-all, end-all basketball league. There were other professional leagues, and so when teams joined the NBA, they were already established to be a good team. After all 8 teams survived the 1948 season, the NBA added 4 more teams under its wing for 1949. The Minneapolis, now Los Angeles Lakers, Rochester Royals, now Sacramento Kings, Fort Wayne, now Detroit Pistons, and Indianapolis Jets, now the 6 feet deep casket livers because yeah, they only made it one season. Indianapolis would get a new team the following season, the Indianapolis Olympians, who lasted 3 times as long as the Jets, 3 years. They folded after 3 years instead of 1. Going back to 1949, the Jets were one of the league's worst teams, and as we said, subsequently folded. The Pistons were pretty bad, the Royals were actually pretty good, and the new Minneapolis Lakers won the championship. We're 3 for 3 on brand new NBA teams winning the title. I've just placed $50,000 on the unnamed potential Las Vegas NBA team to win it all. But again, this isn't as miraculous as it seems. All 4 of these expansion teams joined the NBA from the rival National Basketball League, or the NBL, and the Lakers, who already had the most promising young player in the sport, George Mikan, had no issue adjusting to their new league. Now, one detail I need to address now is that for these first 3 seasons, the NBA actually didn't technically exist yet. The league I've been talking about was the Basketball Association of America, or BAA, which is the same organization as the NBA, it just wasn't called that yet. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, after 4 teams from the competitor NBL joined the BAA and clearly found success, the 2 leagues agreed on a merger, taking elements from both leagues' names to form the National Basketball Association. Now, this merger made the NBA look a lot more like its modern-day counterpart, with many familiar faces coming over in the 1950 deal, such as the Anderson Meat Packers, Sheboygan basketball team / Commanders, Waterloo Hawks, the Denver Nuggets, but not to be confused with the Denver Nuggets, the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, then Milwaukee Hawks, then St. Louis Hawks, now Atlanta Hawks, and finally the Syracuse Nationals, who are now the Philadelphia 76ers. What the hell is this? This was certainly an ambitious expansion. After 3 of the 4 NBL expansion teams survived the 1949 BAA season, the league let their new team's weird cousins come to the function, and let's say they were checking that weather app a bit too much. They did not fit in. Out of the 6 teams that came over from the NBL, the Nationals, Blackhawks, and Packers actually did alright. The basketball team / Commanders somehow snuck into the playoffs with a disgusting 22 and 40 record, and the Waterloo Hawks and OG Denver Nuggets, they were just there. We know that the Nationals and Blackhawks stuck around forever to become some of the NBA's most long-standing franchises, but as for the other 4 oddball teams, they were out as soon as they got in. I call them oddball teams not out of disrespect, but out of genuine curiosity. What the hell are these cities? Anderson, Indiana, Waterloo, Iowa, and Sheboygan, Wisconsin were in the NBA? The league they came from, the NBL, started its life as the Midwestern Basketball Division, as the Midwestern United States was one of the first regions where basketball had gained popularity. So these professional basketball teams formed in these smaller Midwestern industrial cities. Once they joined the NBA to bring it up to 16 teams, the failing NBA realized, shit, we got too much dip on our chip, and dropped these teams to form their own league similar to the old Midwestern League that only lasted for 1 season. After the NBL merger didn't quite go as expected, the now 11-team NBA didn't add any new expansion teams for over a decade and had shed down to just 8 teams by the time the next one came around. That may sound like a bad thing, but in the meantime of no expansion teams, the NBA started to form an identity. You had George Mikan and the Minneapolis Lakers becoming the league's first dynasty, and then after that, the rise of the Boston Celtics, with Bill Russell and friends winning their first championship in 1957. Lakers and Celtics dominated, huh? Oh, how times would change. But this isn't a complete NBA history video, this is a video about expansion teams. Fuck Bill Russell and his greatness, we need to talk about the Chicago Packers. Because the Windy City's first NBA franchise, the Chicago Stags, folded in 1950, it made a lot of sense for such a prominent city to get the NBA's first true expansion team. They rebranded in their second season and moved out of Chicago entirely in their third. The Chicago Packers turned Chicago Zephyrs had two star players during their 2 seasons in Chicago, Walt Bellamy and Terry Dischinger. But for whatever reason, Chicago didn't seem ready for a pro basketball team yet. They didn't start off well, pissing off half their potential fans by naming them the same name as Chicago's football team's bitter rivals. That's a smart move. And after 2 seasons, management would move the team to Baltimore to eventually become them. At least I can be pretentious about my Wizards fandom now.
Well, for basketball, I'm a big Packers guy, yeah, I mean, if you couldn't tell already.
After Chicago's second NBA team survived the expansion years but relocated quickly, the NBA would deliberate long and hard to get a team that stuck around for real this time, unlike Chicago. Ultimately, the NBA decided that its next expansion franchise following Chicago would be located in Chicago. Third time's the charm, they say. And I can't say they were wrong. The Chicago Bulls would join the NBA in 1966, becoming the NBA's 10th team to that point, and obviously we know how this one ends. From Artis Gilmore to Jordan and Pippen to Derrick Rose to Josh Giddey, this team bleeds excellence throughout its entire history. I think they're bleeding out excellence at this point. Someone go check on them. But regarding the Bulls' first season in the league, they were pretty good. Gone were the days of established professional teams joining the NBA and wreaking havoc from the beginning. No, the Bulls were the first modern expansion team in my eyes, as they had an expansion draft. As I explained earlier, the expansion draft is basically a way for new teams to start off with some talent from other teams. Not great talent, but enough to compete. The Bulls did well in this expansion draft, picking rookie Jerry Sloan from Baltimore, who didn't get much playing time over there. He immediately made an impact, making an all-star team and helping the Bulls sneak into the playoffs in their inaugural season. The Chicago Bulls are definitely one of the best modern era expansion teams. They wasted no time being good, making the playoffs in 8 of their first 9 seasons. Their early success, as well as the growing popularity of the league, sparked a huge surge of expansion. Over the 1968 to 1971 seasons, 7 new teams would join the battle. In order, these 7 teams were the San Diego, now Houston Rockets, Seattle Supersonics, now OKC Thunder, Phoenix Suns, Milwaukee Bucks, Portland Trail Blazers, Cleveland Cavaliers, and Buffalo Braves, now Los Angeles Clippers. Now this is the time when the NBA started to look like the NBA. The 1970s are rather forgettable in NBA history now due to the lack of one era-defining team or a dynasty. I believe this was partially caused by the rapid influx of teams during this era and the talent being shared all around. All 7 of these teams set the blueprint for most future expansion teams. Be really bad when you first join, benefit from the guaranteed high draft picks, and waste no time getting good. The Rockets set the losses record year 1, and they ended up with Hall of Famer Elvin Hayes. The Bucks were really bad, they got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The Blazers sucked too, and they got Bill Walton. The Buffalo Braves sucked, they got Bob McAdoo. You get the point. Tanking in this era was like too overpowered. Unlike today, where even the worst team only has a 14% shot at the first pick, in the infancy of the modern style NBA draft, the bottom 2 teams did a coin flip to decide the first pick. As long as you were in that bottom 2, you had 50-50 odds. The Milwaukee Bucks especially made a mockery of this system. They didn't even have to try to win their first championship. They won 27 games in their first season, which isn't even bad for an expansion team, but it was bad enough to make it to the coin flip where they won the first pick, drafted generational prospect Lou Alcindor, now Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and immediately became contenders. Throw in a scam trade for an unhappy Oscar Robertson, and they won it all in year 3 of existence. The Trailblazers also did this to a lesser extent. They won the championship in year 7 of existing because they got Bill Walton in their coin flip. Now, of course, tanking does still exist today, but with a lottery system that rewarded the worst teams way more often, expansion teams had no problem quickly building an empire. These were the times of 22-year-old rookies who changed the game much more than they do today. Kareem coming out of college was already like a top 3 player in the league. This trend would continue with the NBA's next expansion franchise in 1974, The illustrious New Orleans, now Utah Jazz franchise, never mind, it took them 10 seasons to make the playoffs. Like other non-ball-knowing, anti-Sam Presti-coded owners of this era, the Jazz had a weird obsession with trading all of their picks. They were not good over their first 9 seasons, but despite that, they only made their own first-round pick once during that span. They did this to make moves like trading for Pete Maravich from the Hawks, which was cool I guess, but it clearly wasn't enough to make them good. In 84 and 85, they drafted, with their own picks, John Stockton and Karl Malone, and the rest, for better or for worse, is history. The Jazz definitely didn't follow the expansion team trend of the time, trading their top picks year after year just to fall short of even mediocrity, but after a while, 2 unassuming first round picks saved their franchise kinda sorta, moving on, whatever. If you didn't know, throughout this rapid period of expansion from 1966 to 1976, the NBA's first legitimate competitor had emerged and became a worthy opponent to the league, that being the American Basketball Association, or the ABA. This may explain why the NBA added so many teams during this era, because they had to keep an upper hand over their little bro. And it worked, as in 1976, the 2 leagues would finally agree to merge. Ah yes, the iconic NBA-ABA merger. For some reason, it's become the butt of a joke similar to like, since the dinosaurs roamed the earth. Finally broke out of my slump, bro. I hadn't made a 3 since the merger. But do you know how this merger actually happened and what actually went on? The ABA formed assuming that it would very soon be absorbed into the NBA, and the 2 leagues agreed to do it all the way back in 1970. But a lawsuit brought forth by Oscar Robertson and the Players Union delayed it all the way till 1976. By the time the ABA and NBA finally worked out the deal, the NBA said that they would only take 4 teams from the ABA. Although the ABA had 10 teams going into its final season, this action of cutting it down to 4 mostly worked itself out by the time the merger came around. One of these 10 teams folded before the season even began, 2 of them folded mid-season, 1 of them folded during the playoffs after they didn't make it, which left 6 teams to fill 4 spots. The first of the 2 teams that didn't make it, the Kentucky Colonels, were a prestigious ABA franchises, but the Chicago Bulls lobbied hard for them to be excluded from the merger. Why did they care? Basically, when the ABA and NBA existed simultaneously, the best college stars would be drafted by both leagues, and then the 2 teams who had their rights would bid amongst themselves on who actually got that player. This worked fine when the 2 leagues were separate, but when they were set to merge, some ABA stars had already been drafted by NBA teams, which meant they would join those teams if their existing ABA team folded. The Bulls had the NBA rights to the Colonels' best player, Artis Gilmore, so if they folded, they would get Artis Gilmore automatically, and they did. The Colonels owner knew his time was coming, and he folded the team for $3 million cash instead of fighting to get into the league any further. Not a bad outcome, but it obviously would have been better if they joined and became a long-standing NBA franchise like the Pacers did. It's also a hell of a lot worse than what the other team managed to pull off. The Spirits of St. Louis, as they were called at the time, were a mediocre ABA team owned by rich brothers Daniel and Ozzie Silna, who made their fortune in the booming industry of technology, oil, petroleum. Are they the ones that started Burger King? Tobacco. Polyester. Oh yeah! The Spirits were clearly the odd ones out amongst the ABA teams who hadn't folded yet. They were decisively not one of the 4 teams to make the jump, but the brothers struck themselves a deal. As a consolation for their valuable business suddenly becoming worthless, they would receive 1/7 of each ABA merging team's TV revenue every year. Do the math. That's essentially 4/7 of an NBA team's TV revenue every year coming into your pockets despite not owning and operating an NBA team. Still not grasping how big of a deal this is? Guess how much money they made from this? What, $10-20 million you say? Maybe 50? 800 million! Their shares finally got bought back in 2014 by the 4 ABA teams for $500 million, meaning they no longer collect money, But Jesus Christ, man, almost $1 billion just for being in the right place at the right time. A third of you watching this are about to enroll for a sports management degree. Anyway, that's the brief rundown of the NBA-ABA merger, the NBA's biggest expansion since the ambitious BAA-NBL merger. Emerging from the rubble and making it into the league were the Indiana Pacers, Denver Nuggets, New York, then New Jersey, now Brooklyn Nets, and the San Antonio Spurs. These 4 teams saw very mixed results upon entering their supposed Big Brother League. The Nuggets, Spurs, and Pacers all brought virtually the same core team over, and they all experienced slightly worse but overall very similar results to their last season in the ABA. The Nets, however, didn't make as smooth of a transition to say the least. They were awful in their first season, having the league's worst record by a long shot, despite winning the last ever ABA championship. How could this be? Well, each ABA team had to pay a $3 million expansion fee to the NBA, but the Nets had to pay an additional fee to the Knicks for infringing on their region. This meant the Nets owner had to sell by far their best player as well as the ABA's best player, Julius Erving, to the 76ers to help pay for this additional cost. As a result, the Nets went from first to worst, and from there, never truly recovered. They did move to New Jersey though. As for the other teams' futures, the Spurs definitely fared the best out of these 4 teams. They almost immediately became a great NBA team with George Gervin and Larry Keenan, and as we probably all know, that would continue. A dynasty spanning the late 90s to the mid-teens, not to mention consistent playoff contention in between, the Spurs are definitely a top 5 NBA franchise ever at this point. As for the Nuggets and Pacers, both teams have had great times in the NBA so far, but until 2023, neither had won a championship. Overall, the merger told the NBA that not only was the ABA a valiant competitor, but also that expansion was far from over. At just 22 teams, the NBA was far from satisfied, and although the league had stagnated in popularity throughout the 70s, the 80s would grow the game to new heights, and with that came more new expansion teams. The NBA kicked off the new decade by introducing its 23rd team, the Dallas Mavericks. It wasn't surprising to see Dallas get an expansion team, as they had an ABA team, the Dallas Chaparrals, which eventually became the Spurs, so although they were the NBA's 3rd team in Texas, the Mavs owners had interest at a time when the NBA still wasn't really profitable, and they were ultimately awarded a team. Their first season, they were really bad, as their first draft pick, Kiki Vandeweghe, held out and forced a trade, so without his help, they won just 15 games. It paid off though. They won the coin flip and took All-Star Mark Aguirre with the first pick, as well as All-Star Rolando Blackman with the 9th pick, which they got from the Vandeweghe trade. The Mavs were a playoff mainstay by just their 4th season, and although there's been plenty of ups and downs, they have one of the best finals runs to their name. Even if they traded Luka. The Mavericks would be the last expansion team for 8 years though, the longest span without one since the Chicago Zephyrs in 1961. The NBA gained lots of popularity throughout the 80s, with the Bird-Magic rivalry as well as Michael Jordan's arrival into the league bringing tons of fresh eyes to the sport. As a result, the NBA decided that the late 80s would kick off another expansion boom. Kicking this off in 1988, the NBA's 24th and 25th teams would debut. The Charlotte Hornets of the Eastern Conference, while the Western Conference got the Miami Heat. Don't you love geography? The NBA must have been lobbying Big Compass at the time, because how do you justify this? Prior to and during this era of expansion, many modern teams we automatically associate with one conference were in another. Before 1980, the Pacers and Bucks were in the West, whereas the Rockets and Spurs were in the East. The Pistons and Bulls were also in the West at some point. It's just an inevitable consequence of league expansion. You have to realign it to make more geographical sense, so teams get tossed around. Because the NBA had to keep their 2 conferences balanced, this meant some wacky conference places before the NBA could get everything in order. As a result, the Heat had to be in the West that season. No, they didn't! Before 1988, the East had one less team than the West. If you add an even number of teams, the conferences are still going to be unbalanced. Why not just add both of these teams to the East? Well, the next season, 2 more Eastern teams were added, the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Orlando Magic. Minnesota is west enough for the Wolves to be in the Western Conference without raising an eyebrow, so they got placed in the West while the Magic moved to the East. But the Heat also moved to the East, so they just learned their lesson and gave the East 1 extra team, right? Wait, what are the Hornets doing there? They just swapped places with the Heat, even though, again, the East had an open spot. Okay, the next season they learned their lesson, they're back in the East. Why are the Magic in the West now? And then finally, the season after that, they did the unthinkable and just put the Magic in the East, where they belong. The East had 1 more team than usual. This all could have been solved by putting both the Hornets and the Heat in the East to begin with, but instead, they had these teams trading a nonsensical Western Conference spot around like they're Wendy's employees taking turns with the night shift. Okay, enough of that bullshit. How did these basketball teams actually play? Starting with the Charlotte Hornets, they kickstarted their franchise with Kelly Tripucka, a washed-up fringe all-star, and Rex Chapman, a rookie who'd become a very solid but not star-level player. Unsurprisingly, they were terrible, but unlike the terrible expansion teams of the 70s who could immediately guarantee a top 2 pick, the primitive NBA draft lottery meant Charlotte ended up with pick number 5 following this terrible season. They would eventually land some great players in the draft and become a solid playoff team, but then they moved to New Orleans where the good fortunes would quickly run out. This version of the Charlotte Hornets is confusing because they do share a history with the Charlotte Hornets we know of today, sorry for them, but they aren't the same franchise. These Charlotte Hornets who joined in 1988 are actually the modern day Pelicans. The new Charlotte Hornets were an expansion team we'll get to later. The Miami Heat, who were the NBA's West Coast representative in the 1988 expansion, no, I will not stop harping on this, were even worse than the Hornets were in year number 1. The Heat put out an uber young roster that included 10, yes 10 rookies in 1988, and unsurprisingly won just 15 games. They got equally screwed over in the 1989 lottery, getting the worst possible outcome in the 4th pick, but Glenn Rice wasn't a bad consolation prize. In fact, he had by far the best career out of the guys in that range. The Heat took a while to get going, but by the mid-90s, they had landed prime Tim Hardaway, Alonzo Mourning, and Jamal Mashburn among others, and while they fell short with that team, they'd maintain excellence overall, winning 3 championships before their 30th birthday. Following those 2 teams' earth-shattering arrival to the association, the 1989 season saw 2 more expansion teams in Orlando and Minnesota. Minnesota, specifically the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, makes perfect sense to house an NBA franchise. Orlando, kind of a weird one. The city of Orlando has become more qualified per se to have an NBA team nowadays, as it has grown its tourist economy, but at the same time, Orlando didn't even have a major airport or arena to play games in. But nevertheless, they went through with the project. The Magic debuted, and the rest is history. They peaked in their 6th season. The Magic started off their franchise pretty well. Not in win-loss record, they won just 18 games their first year, but in drafting. They got the assist god Scott Skiles in the expansion draft and took legendary free throw shooter Nick Anderson with their first ever draft pick. This launched them into a pretty run-of-the-mill rebuild to start their team, which obviously culminated in the back-to-back draft selections of Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway. This duo brought them to the NBA Finals in 1995 in just their 3rd and 2nd seasons before unfortunately getting swept by the more experienced Houston Rockets. Having just made the finals in their 6th ever season, they look to be on as good of a trajectory as any team can, before they lowballed the hell out of their franchise savior, causing him to somehow leave in free agency after just his 4th season, which put them into purgatory, only to land another top-tier center who also brought them to the finals early on before he also left to the Lakers. Yeah, the Magic haven't really won anything, have they? Their expansion class of 89 counterparts, the Minnesota Timberwolves, didn't have as wild of a ride. Instead of a crazy up-and-down Disney World roller coaster the Magic were riding in their first several seasons, the Timberwolves were more on like a 25-mile-per-hour residential road. It was just all lows. Their first season went like the others. They sucked, had to rely on a high draft pick, got screwed in the lottery, whatever. Normally I would just skim over this, as I know this is getting repetitive at this point, but I need to introduce you to the superstar of the baby Timberwolves. Meet Tony Campbell. A star in college, he was drafted 20th to the Pistons and spent the first 5 seasons of his career collecting dust on the phenomenal Pistons and then Lakers teams of the late 80s. After 2 seasons with the Lakers, including a championship season in '88, he decided to sign to the Timberwolves for their first ever season. To this point in his career, through 5 seasons and 254 games played, he had amassed just 1,633 points, His first season in Minnesota, he scores 1,903. Tony Campbell is the living, breathing embodiment of the phrase good stats, bad team. This dude barely cracked the rotation on 2 contending teams, joins the new guys, and puts up more points than he ever did in his last 5 seasons. Campbell was their loyal tank commander, serving them well with inefficient buckets and little impact on winning for 3 whole seasons before the Timberwolves moved on in exchange for a second-round pick from the Knicks. A testament to how little this guy actually meant to the team. He was in Minnesota to get buckets and nothing more. Can't say I blame the guy. Clown him all you want, but not many people can say they made the NBA, let alone average 23 points a game in it. The Timberwolves' mediocrity early on can be explained by taking one look at their draft history. There wasn't one good pick until they took KG going into their 7th season as a team, which clearly didn't stop their bad drafting, because all you can say about Kevin Garnett's time with the Timberwolves is how poor a job they did at surrounding him with talent. Save for the Miami Heat, the NBA's 4 expansion teams from the late 80s have never broken through and won a title. The Magic have gotten close a couple of times, sandwiched in between plenty of years of mid. The Timberwolves are like that, but even worse, and then the Hornets, I mean, come on. These 4 teams would round off NBA expansion for a while, at least in America. That's right, in the mid-90s, the NBA had enough of those stars and stripes, and instead hit the curldies up for some ball. The Canadian expansion. Calling it that makes it sound cooler than it was. This wasn't the NBA's first venture into Canada. You guys remember the Toronto Huskies? But it was the NBA's first venture into Canada, let's be real. Starting with the Raptors, they took a while to get off their feet. They made pretty solid draft decisions early on, snagging Damon Stoudemire in their first draft, Marcus Camby in the next, and then of course Tracy McGrady and Vince Carter. But for whatever reason, they didn't keep and develop the first 3 long term, and although Vince was phenomenal, he couldn't be a one-man show, and eventually, in his 7th season and the franchise's 10th, he was traded, bringing them back to square one. Ouch. Isn't it weird to think that Chris Bosh and Vince Carter overlapped in Toronto for a year and a half? That could have turned into a sick duo, but Vince's relationship with the franchise was fucked beyond repair by that point, so the original Raptors era was officially behind them. While the original Raptors might have been disappointing, it could have been worse than whatever the fuck was going on out in Western Canada. The Vancouver Grizzlies were the other Canadian expansion team, and outside of these sick-ass jerseys, yeah, these boys really had nothing going for them. The Grizzlies started off on a heater, taking Bryant Big Country Reeves with their first ever draft selection. Talk about an identity crisis. You're the first Canadian team in almost 50 years, and you take a guy who's rightfully earned the nickname Big Country? They won just 15 games that inaugural season, getting Sharif Abdul-Rahim with the 3rd pick, probably their best draft choice in Vancouver. They'd get worse and worse, leading to an 8-42 season in 1999 that gave them the opportunity to draft Stevie Franchise Francis, their savior. The one who turned them around, like Bill Walton with the Blazers or Vince Carter with the Raptors. Nope, he refused to play in Vancouver, so they had to trade him. And they didn't get another high draft pick. Nope, they got a bunch of table scraps. This was bad. This was arguably going worse than any expansion team in history, at least in the modern era. Almost immediately following the Francis debacle, the team was sold, with the first priority being relocation. Eventually, Memphis, Tennessee was declared the lucky winner of the Grizzlies sweepstakes, and they've carried on there ever since. You might notice, as time went on, expansion teams found it harder to find their footing in a league that was getting bigger and better with each new team. The expansion teams of the early years were winning championships from day one. The ones of the 60s and 70s were winning championships within a decade. The ones of the 80s were becoming playoff contenders within the decade, and the ones of the 90s were so bad that one of them had to relocate. At this point in the league's history, we're at 29 total teams. There's room for one expansion team to bring us to that round number 30. One expansion team to end all expansion teams. Probably not with how this shit's going. The huggable, lovable Charlotte Bobcats. The NBA's 30th, and as of 2025, most recent expansion team. Beginning play in the 04-05 season, the Bobcats were an expansion team to replace the Charlotte Hornets, who had moved to New Orleans just 2 seasons prior. Charlotte's fans didn't have to wait long at all to have NBA basketball back in their town, as in January 2003, less than than a year after the Hornets skipped town, the NBA's 30th expansion franchise was approved to be in Charlotte. Keep in mind that the old Charlotte Hornets were a pretty good team. They were consistently in the Eastern Conference playoffs, and they left the city following a season where they had won a playoff series. The Bobcats had some decent sized shoes to fill. They were given a lift in their first ever draft as they were awarded the second pick ahead of their inaugural season, which they used on Emeka Okafor out of UConn. They weren't good in their first season, but looked very promising as Okafor took home Rookie of the Year honors and expansion draft pickup Gerald Wallace looked to be a steal for Charlotte. The Charlotte Bobcats actually started off like a lot of other expansion teams. They weren't good, but they were working their way up, and eventually they made the playoffs in 2010. Just their 6th season. I mean, there's a world where they're in the conference finals 2 years after that. But you guys know that shit didn't happen. What was once a promising young franchise turned into the laughingstock of the league in 2 short years. They changed owners in 2010. That must have been the turning point. Who the hell caused all this? Oh right, Michael Jordan bought the team. The Bobcats' downfall time and time again throughout their short history has been their total lack of good drafting. From the inception of their franchise through 2016, their only great draft picks were Gerald Wallace in the expansion draft, if that even counts, and Kemba Walker in the late lottery. The rest were either whatever to holy shit, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist was your consolation prize for the worst record ever. I am so sorry, Hornets fans. Oh yeah, Hornets. The Bobcats would eventually take back the Hornets branding after the OG Hornets, now in New Orleans, became the Pelicans, which gave the new Hornets the old Hornets history from when they were in Charlotte. That's helping them out big time on Basketball Reference, because if you take away those solid Hornets teams from the 90s, you're left with 3 playoff appearances and 21 seasons of existence. Jesus. The Bobcats, now Hornets, are one of the most infamously bad franchises in league history, and in their case, while the lottery balls could have done them more favors, a 20+ year sample size kinda proves that you're the problem, not the lottery balls. And there you have it. Every expansion team in NBA history and their struggles or laughable lack thereof with assimilating into the league. I think some important takeaways from this are, well, 1, expansion teams are almost always going to suck. I probably wouldn't put down 50 grand on the Seattle Supersonics winning it all in their first year. But 2, and more importantly, the NBA is not going to be done expanding anytime soon. The biggest trend in sports these days is more. More teams means more games to sell tickets for, more playoff games to air in an inevitably bigger bracket, and more chances to put QR code sponsorships on jerseys. All things that I don't really think the NBA would shy away from. The real question we have to ask though is, how would an expansion team fare in the modern NBA? Again, we haven't seen one in over 20 years. The league is so deep with talent nowadays that I find it hard to believe that an expansion team wouldn't look good on paper. But that's a double-edged sword. You may not agree, but I think the league is more talented than ever today. Even play-in teams look super good. How would an expansion team win more than 10-15 games? But that's a question for another day. For now, you have all the knowledge you need regarding NBA expansion teams throughout history, including probably the most useful at all. If you're considering rooting for a new expansion team in the modern NBA, I would use your one point of reference you have to a 21st century NBA expansion team and ask yourself, do you want to be that?